Arthur and Eleanor Sterling had just stepped out of a high-end boutique at Pioneer Place in downtown Portland, the weight of a velvet box containing a diamond necklace for their daughter Grace's master's graduation heavy in Arthur's pocket. As they neared the exit, Arthur headed toward the parking garage to retrieve his vintage Cadillac, while Eleanor lingered behind to take what she claimed was an urgent call from her arts foundation, a demand for her attention that Arthur, in his absolute trust, never thought to question. He was only a few yards from his vehicle when a weathered man in a security uniform, a silver-haired veteran named Sam Vance, stepped into his path with a deliberate, heavy gait. "Is that your wife?" the man asked in a low, gravelly tone, nodding back toward the elegant woman standing by the fountain. Arthur nodded, his analytical mind already beginning to catalog the grim, reluctant expression on the stranger's face. Without another word, Sam pulled out a smartphone and tapped the screen. "Mr. Sterling," he whispered, "I think you're going to want to see this." 30 seconds later, the world Arthur had spent 72 years meticulously building began to dissolve. What he saw on that small screen made his stomach drop with a cold, sickening finality. The video footage was grainy, yet the subjects were unmistakable. It was level 3 of this very garage, dated only 2 weeks prior. Eleanor, usually the embodiment of poise and restraint, was pinned against a concrete pillar by a man in a charcoal suit. Her laughter, a sound Arthur associated with anniversaries and quiet Sunday mornings, was bright and flirtatious. The man was Julian Vane. Arthur recognized him from the guest lists of Eleanor's recent charity galas, a renowned cardiac surgeon with a reputation for precision. On the screen, that precision was directed at Eleanor. His hands were on her waist, and the way she leaned into him suggested a deep, practiced intimacy that made the 30 years of their marriage feel like a staged play. The kiss was not a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a confirmation of a long-term betrayal. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face, leaving a cold, prickling sensation that traveled down his arms. As a former senior behavioral analyst for the agency, he had spent decades in interrogation rooms watching men lie about treason and murder. He had been trained to compartmentalize trauma, to separate the pulse of the heart from the logic of the mind. He did not lash out. He did not let the roar in his ears drown out the necessity of the moment. Instead, he employed a tactical breathing cycle he had mastered decades ago. He inhaled for 4 seconds, held for 4, and exhaled for 4. He watched the heart rate monitor in his mind stabilize. He had to be a ghost. He had to be the architect. Sam Vance watched him with a weary, knowing pity. The security guard spoke of seeing the two of them here at least 4 times in the past month, always at the same hour, always with the same hurried, electric energy. Sam admitted he had debated whether to say anything, but the sight of Arthur, so dignified and yet so utterly unaware, had forced his hand. Arthur nodded slowly, his voice a dry rasp as he thanked Sam and asked for a digital copy of the file. He memorized Sam's contact details with the automatic precision of a man filing a field report, already calculating how to use this asset. He turned and walked back toward the fountain where Eleanor was waiting. To anyone else, she looked like a dedicated professional, her eyes still bright from the excitement of her phone call. She tucked her device into her handbag and smiled at him, a rehearsed, melodic expression. She mentioned that the board was thrilled with the new gala theme, never suspecting that the man walking beside her was currently performing a forensic autopsy on every syllable she spoke. Arthur offered a thin, practiced smile in return, his mind already miles away. The drive back to their Tudor estate in the West Hills was conducted in a silence that Eleanor seemed to take for peace. Arthur kept his hand steady at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel of the Cadillac, his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked pavement of Broadway. Beside him, Eleanor chatted about the diamond necklace and how Grace would cherish it as a symbol of her achievement. She spoke of the future, of Grace's career in engineering, and of their own upcoming anniversary trip to Florence. Every word she uttered was now a data point for Arthur to analyze, a layer of the elaborate fiction she had maintained for months, or perhaps years. Arthur felt a strange, cold clarity descending upon him. This was no longer his home or his marriage. It was a theater of operations. He was entering a state of total operational readiness, a mental bunker he had not inhabited since his final days in the field. He would not confront her tonight. He would not give her the opportunity to lie or to hide the money he now suspected was missing. He would observe, document, and prepare. As they pulled into the driveway, the yellow porch light cast long, skeletal shadows across the lawn, reflecting the skeletal remains of his trust. He looked at the house he had built and saw only a structure of lies. The man Eleanor had married was gone, replaced by an analyst who knew that the only way to win a war was to let the enemy think they had already won. The aftermath of the discovery had begun, and Arthur would ensure it was handled with the clinical finality of a master of his craft. The heavy oak door of his private study clicked shut, sealing Arthur Sterling into a world of leather-bound books and the faint, comforting scent of pipe tobacco. It was a sanctuary that had served as his intellectual bunker for over 20 years, but tonight, the atmosphere felt sterile and cold. Arthur did not turn on the overhead lights. Instead, he sat in his high-backed wing chair, allowing the pale moonlight from the Portland sky to filter through the rain-streaked windows. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the armrests, and began the process of deconstructing the last 6 months of his life. As a senior behavioral analyst, Arthur knew that the greatest obstacle to the truth was often the heart. He had been blinded by a phenomenon he had spent his career warning others about: confirmation bias. He had loved Eleanor with a loyalty that bordered on the absolute, and because of that love, his brain had filtered out every anomaly, every red flag, and every deviation from her established baseline. Now, with the sickening clarity of the security footage burned into his retinas, he forced himself to lower his emotional shields. He began to run a retrospective analysis, treating his own memories as a series of cold, hard data points. He started with the month of February. That was when the first subtle shift had occurred. Eleanor had begun wearing a new fragrance, something expensive and floral with notes of sandalwood and rose. It was a sharp departure from the clean, citrus scent she had favored for nearly 3 decades. At the time, she had claimed it was a gift from a wealthy donor at the Arts Foundation, and Arthur had accepted the explanation without a second thought. Now, he recognized it as the scent of a woman trying to reinvent herself for a new audience. He cataloged the memory and moved to the next. Then there was the digital tether. Arthur recalled a specific night in April when they were sitting in this very room. A notification had chimed on Eleanor's phone at 2 in the morning. Usually, she was a light sleeper who valued her rest, but that night, she had reached for the device with a frantic, hungry energy. When he had asked who was calling at such an hour, she had blamed a server error at the hospital foundation, her voice rising an octave in a classic defensive spike. He remembered the micro tremor in her fingers and the way she had immediately turned the phone face down. To an analyst, these were textbook signs of the ostrich effect, an attempt to hide a secret in plain sight. Yet, as a husband, he had simply rolled over and gone back to sleep. The most damning piece of the puzzle was the change in her vocal prosody. Over the last 90 days, Eleanor had begun speaking about Julian Vane with a forced, clinical detachment. Whenever his name came up in relation to the hospital board or the upcoming gala, her tone became overly formal, a linguistic mask used to hide underlying intimacy. Arthur recalled a dinner party where Julian had been a guest. He remembered the way Julian's eyes had lingered on Eleanor, the predatory confidence of a sociopath who knew he was winning a game that the opponent didn't even know they were playing. Julian Vane was not just a surgeon. He was a collector of vulnerabilities, and Eleanor, in her midlife restlessness, had become his latest acquisition. Arthur felt a surge of cold fury, but he suppressed it with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life in the shadows. He knew that an emotional confrontation was exactly what a predator like Julian Vane would expect. It would give Eleanor a chance to cry, to deny, and to potentially move the assets he now suspected were in jeopardy. If he acted on impulse, he would lose the tactical advantage. He needed to be more than a husband seeking vengeance. He needed to be a ghost in his own home. He leaned forward and opened his laptop, the blue light of the screen illuminating the deep lines on his face. He created a new, encrypted partition on his hard drive, titling the file Project Ithaca. He began to type, documenting every late-night board meeting, every unexplained withdrawal from their joint accounts, and every floral scent that had graced their hallways. He would not scream. He would not demand answers that he already knew were lies. Instead, he would build a forensic file that would leave no room for escape. His analytical mind was now fully engaged, overriding the ache in his chest. He realized that for 25 years, he had been the architect of a beautiful, grand structure built on a foundation that had silently rotted away. He would not destroy the building yet. He would wait, watch, and gather the ammunition required for a controlled demolition. As the digital clock on his desk ticked toward midnight, Arthur Sterling ceased to be the man who loved Eleanor. He was once again the senior behavioral analyst, and his target was now the person who slept in the room across the hall. The file was open, the investigation had begun, and Arthur would not stop until he had unraveled every thread of the masterpiece of deception Eleanor and Julian had woven. The rain in Portland had turned from a light drizzle into a relentless downpour by the time Arthur reached the rendezvous point. He had chosen a dim, wood-paneled dive bar on the edge of the Burnside Bridge, a place where the shadows were long and the smell of stale hops and wet wool hung heavy in the air. It was a relic of a different era, far removed from the polished marble of Pioneer Place or the sterile luxury of his West Hills estate. Arthur sat in a corner booth, his back to the wall, watching the entrance with the practiced vigilance of a man who never truly retired from the field. When Sam Vance walked in, he looked less like a security guard and more like a ghost from a past Arthur had never known. The silver-haired veteran scanned the room before sliding into the booth opposite Arthur. He did not order a drink. He simply placed a weathered manila envelope on the scarred table and rested his hands on either side of it. His fingers were thick and calloused, the hands of a man who had spent his life working in the grit of the world while Arthur had lived among the elite. Arthur started the conversation with professional brevity, asking why a security guard at a high-end mall would go to such lengths to document the movements of a stranger's wife. Sam was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching Arthur's face for something buried deep in the bone. Then, with a voice that sounded like grinding stones, he delivered a blow that hit harder than the security footage ever could. Sam explained that he was not just a witness to Eleanor's infidelity. He was a witness to the Sterling family history. 60 years ago, Arthur's father, Thomas Sterling, had attended a legal conference in Sacramento. He had been a man of standing, a pillar of the Portland community with a wife and a 2-year-old son at home. That son was Arthur. But in Sacramento, Thomas had begun an affair with a young woman, a translator who had believed his promises of a new life. When she became pregnant, Thomas had vanished back to the safety of his respectable life in Oregon, leaving behind a son he would never acknowledge. That son was Sam Vance. Arthur felt a cold, hollow sensation opening up in his chest. He thought of his father, the man who had taught him about integrity, honor, and the importance of a legacy. The man he had idolized was a fabrication, a carefully constructed mask that hid a history of abandonment and cowardice. Sam described his own life of struggle, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs, and the one time he had traveled to Portland as a teenager to find his father. Thomas Sterling had looked at him with icy indifference and told him he was a mistake that needed to stay buried. He had threatened to destroy Sam's mother if they ever contacted him again. Sam had spent 43 years holding that secret, watching Arthur's career from a distance, seeing him become a celebrated analyst for the government while Sam moved through the ranks of the police force and eventually into private security. He admitted that a part of him had wanted to hate Arthur for the life he had been given, but as he watched Arthur and Eleanor over the last several months, that resentment had turned into a strange, protective kinship. He could not stand by and watch his own brother be dismantled by the same kind of deception that had defined their father's secret life. He pushed the manila envelope toward Arthur. Inside was the first comprehensive dossier on Julian Vane. Sam, using his old connections as a detective, had spent 60 days digging into the surgeon's past. The results were chilling. Julian Vane was not just a cardiac surgeon. He was a self-styled life coach for the ultra-wealthy, a man who specialized in what he called emotional optimization. In reality, he was a sociopath who targeted women in positions of power or those who held significant marital assets. Sam pointed to a list of names in the report. Julian had followed a near-identical script in Seattle 10 years ago, in San Francisco 7 years ago, and in Denver only 4 years ago. He found women who were experiencing the quiet desperation of a midlife crisis, made them feel seen and revitalized, and then persuaded them to invest in various medical technology startups that existed only on paper. Once the funds were transferred into offshore accounts, Julian would move on to the next city, leaving a trail of broken marriages and empty bank accounts behind him. Arthur scanned the documents, his analytical mind already identifying the patterns of manipulation. Julian was a predator who used his medical credentials as a cloak of respectability. He had convinced Eleanor to believe that she was part of something revolutionary, a partnership that transcended the mundane reality of her marriage to an older man. Arthur realized that Eleanor was not just a cheating wife, she was a mark in a high-stakes long con. The 2 men sat in the dimly lit bar, 2 brothers connected by a father's sin and a stranger's greed. Arthur looked at Sam and saw a reflection of a life that could have been his own if the coin had flipped differently. He reached out and touched the manila envelope, feeling the weight of the war that was now inevitable. He thanked Sam, not just for the information, but for the truth that had been denied to them both for 60 years. As Arthur walked out into the cold Portland rain, he felt a strange sense of alignment. The world was no longer a place of absolute trust and comfortable lies. It was a battlefield. He had an ally he never expected and a target he understood perfectly. He would use every skill the agency had taught him to dismantle Julian Vane's operation piece by piece. The mists of Pioneer Place had cleared, and in their wake, Arthur Sterling saw the path ahead with the lethal precision of an architect. He would protect his daughter, he would reclaim his legacy, and he would ensure that the Sterling name, for the first time in 60 years, was synonymous with the truth. The Tudor house on the hill was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that Arthur had once found soothing but now felt like a countdown to his own obsolescence. After his meeting with Sam Vance, the mists of Portland seemed to have followed Arthur inside, clinging to the corners of the rooms he had called home for 3 decades. If his father had maintained a second life for 60 years, and if Eleanor was currently auditioning for a new one, then the bedrock of Arthur's reality was no longer solid. It was a shifting sand of convenient fictions. As a behavioral analyst, he knew that a lie of the magnitude Eleanor was currently telling rarely existed in a vacuum. Deception was often a lifelong habit, a learned trait that began long before the first hotel room was booked. He stood in the hallway outside the guest room where their daughter, Grace, was sleeping. She had come home for the weekend to finalize the details for her graduation ceremony, the same event for which Arthur carried a diamond necklace in his pocket. Grace was his pride, the one person who made the long, cold years of government service feel worthwhile. She had his temperament, his love for structural logic, and what he had always believed were the sterling family eyes. But as he stood in the shadows, the analytical voice in his head, the one he had tried to silence for the sake of his heart, began to ask the most forbidden question of all. When did the first lie begin? Arthur waited until the house settled into the deep, heavy stillness of 3 in the morning. He moved with the ghost-like silence of a man who had spent a career in surveillance. He entered the guest bathroom, his movements clinical and precise. On the vanity sat Grace's hairbrush, a simple everyday object that now held the potential to be a weapon of total destruction. He used a pair of sterilized tweezers to collect several strands of blonde hair, placing them into a small plastic specimen bag he had prepared in his study. He felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him for treating his own child like a target of interest, but the architect within him demanded the ground truth. He could not build a defense on a foundation of maybes. The next morning, Arthur made a discreet trip to a private laboratory on the outskirts of the city, a facility owned by a former agency colleague who specialized in high-sensitivity genetic testing. He paid for a rush analysis in cash, using a pseudonym and an encrypted email address. Then began the wait. For 72 hours, Arthur existed in a state of hypervigilance that bordered on a waking nightmare. He sat at the dinner table with Eleanor and Grace, watching them laugh over old photo albums. He listened to Eleanor describe the day Grace took her first steps, her voice thick with a maternal warmth that now sounded like a siren song designed to lure him onto the rocks. Every time Grace smiled at him and called him Dad, a jagged shard of ice pierced his chest. On the third day, while Eleanor was at a board meeting and Grace was out with friends, the notification arrived. Arthur sat in his study, the door double-locked. His hands, usually as steady as a surgeon's, trembled slightly as he entered the 24-digit decryption key. The report was titled Case File 917. He scrolled past the legal disclaimers and the technical charts of genetic markers until he reached the final summary. Probability of paternity, 0.0%. The world did not end with a bang or a roar. It ended with the silent flicker of a cursor on a white screen. Arthur stared at the number until it blurred into a meaningless shape. 0. The sum of 24 years of midnight feedings, scraped knees, graduation ceremonies, and fatherly advice. The blonde hair he had brushed, the eyes he had seen his own reflection in, the very soul he had nurtured, were not his. Eleanor had not just begun her betrayal with Julian Vane 6 months ago. She had entered their marriage with a secret so profound it rendered the last quarter-century a calculated fraud. He leaned back in his chair, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. He realized with a cold, forensic detachment that he had been the primary asset in Eleanor's long con. He had provided the status, the West Hills estate, the Ivy League tuition, and the sterling name to a child she had conceived with another man, a man who had presumably vanished before the consequences could take hold. Arthur had been chosen not for his heart, but for his utility. He was the perfect provider, the man so focused on the external shadows of the world that he never noticed the darkness growing in his own bed. The rage that followed was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was not the hot, impulsive anger of a younger man. It was a cold, tectonic shift. Every memory of his life with Eleanor was now being rewritten in real time. The way she had looked at him on their wedding day, the way she had held his hand during Grace's birth, the way she had told him he was the only man she could ever trust. It was all a performance, a 25-year masterpiece of psychological manipulation. She had allowed him to believe he was the architect of their family, when in reality, he was merely the contractor paying for a house she had designed for someone else. Arthur looked at the diamond necklace resting on his desk, the light reflecting off the stones with a mocking brilliance. It was a gift for a daughter who was a stranger. He realized then that he could not simply confront Eleanor. If he did, she would weaponize Grace against him. She would play the victim, accuse him of paranoia, and potentially disappear with the assets he had worked his entire life to secure. No, the architect would not strike yet. He needed to understand the full scope of the invasion. He needed to know if Julian Vane was part of this original lie or merely the latest parasite to feed on the Sterling legacy. Arthur closed the laptop and sat in the darkness, his mind already beginning to map out the next phase of the operation. He had lost his past, his lineage, and his sense of self, but he still had his intellect. And as he had told many targets in the past, an intellect with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous weapon in the world. He would protect Grace, for she was innocent of her mother's sins, but for Eleanor and Julian, the architect was preparing a final, clinical reckoning. The morning after the paternity revelation, Arthur Sterling did not go to his usual breakfast at the club. Instead, he remained in his study, the doors locked, the air conditioning humming a low, mechanical tune that drowned out the sounds of Eleanor humming in the kitchen downstairs. He sat before a dual monitor setup, the blue light reflecting in his glasses like a digital predator. He had spent his life profiling the enemies of the state, but Julian Vane was a different breed of threat. Julian was a parasite who understood the architecture of the human ego better than any field agent Arthur had ever interrogated. Using the encrypted dossier provided by Sam Vance as a jumping-off point, Arthur began a deep dive into the digital footprint of Julian Vane. He utilized private databases and backdoor access codes he had retained from his years in the agency, moving through layers of firewalls with the silent precision of a ghost. He wasn't just looking for bank accounts or medical records. He was looking for the script. A sociopath like Vane never changed his opening act. He simply changed the stage and the lead actress. The pattern emerged with a chilling, mathematical symmetry. 10 years ago in Seattle, there was a woman named Hannah Shepard, a hospital administrator who had lost her marriage and $300,000 to a medical equipment startup that vanished overnight. 7 years ago in San Francisco, the target was Audrey Kingsley, the chief financial officer of a major university medical center. 3 years ago in Denver, it was Valerie Porter. Every victim fit the same psychological profile: 50 years old, professionally successful but emotionally starved, and standing at the precipice of a midlife transition. Julian Vane did not seduce these women with sex. He seduced them with the promise of being the hero in their own story. Arthur placed a secure, untraceable call to Audrey Kingsley. It took 4 attempts before she agreed to speak, her voice coming through the speaker with the brittle, hollow quality of someone who had survived a catastrophic house fire. She confirmed every suspicion Arthur held. Julian had approached her not as a lover, but as a visionary partner. He had used a specific lexicon of empowerment and spiritual optimization, convincing her that her marriage to a stable, older man was a cage of mediocrity. He had persuaded her to liquidate her mother's inheritance to fund a revolutionary diagnostic platform. When the money hit an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, Julian disappeared, leaving her to face a board of directors and a husband who no longer recognized her. Arthur listened to Audrey's story with a clinical coldness that masked a burgeoning sense of strategic pity. He realized that Eleanor was currently in the 3rd act of this very same play. She wasn't a co-conspirator in a grand romance. She was a mark being groomed for a total financial harvest. Julian had likely spent months identifying her insecurities, her desire for the limelight, and her fear of fading into the background of Arthur's distinguished retirement. He had created a vacuum of dissatisfaction in her life and then filled it with himself. The psychological profile was now complete. Julian Vane was an emotional hunter who relied on the shame of his victims to ensure his own safety. He knew that women like Eleanor Sterling would rather lose their life savings than admit to their husbands and their social circles that they had been so easily manipulated. He banked on their silence. He relied on the very dignity that Arthur had spent 30 years cultivating in their household. Arthur leaned back, his eyes fixed on a photograph of Julian Vane taken at a medical conference. The man looked charming. His smile hit the perfect note of professional warmth and personal interest. But Arthur looked past the smile. He looked at the micro-expressions, the stillness of the eyes, the lack of genuine empathy in the set of the jaw. He saw the predator. He saw a man who believed he was the only intelligent actor on a stage full of puppets. Arthur realized that he could not simply warn Eleanor. She was too far under the influence of the grooming process. Any attempt to expose Julian would be viewed by her as an act of jealousy or patriarchal control. She would run toward the predator, believing he was her only protector. No, the architect understood that to catch a man who traded in shadows, one had to become the darkest shadow in the room. He would allow the script to continue. He would let Julian Vane believe that Arthur Sterling was a tired, 72-year-old man whose best days were behind him. He would let the predator think the cage was empty. As he closed the file on Audrey Kingsley, Arthur felt a strange, detached clarity. He was no longer just a husband or a father. He was a behavioral analyst hunting a sociopath. He had the profile, he had the pattern, and he had the motivation. Julian Vane had made a fatal error. He had tried to harvest a resource that belonged to a man who knew how to dismantle souls for a living. The hunt was no longer about a broken marriage. It was about a total, forensic destruction of Julian Vane's world. Arthur opened a new document and began to map out the financial connections, his mind already anticipating the next move in a game Julian didn't even realize had started. He would find the money, he would find the fraud, and then he would find the justice that Audrey Kingsley and the others had been too ashamed to seek. Arthur closed the encrypted dossier on Julian Vane and turned his attention to a different kind of map, the movement of his own capital. In the world of intelligence, a man could lie with his eyes, his voice, and even his DNA, but a ledger was a confession that never blinked. He began with their primary joint brokerage account, a fund he had built over 40 years of careful saving and strategic investment. It was supposed to be the bedrock of their retirement, a guarantee that Grace would never want for anything. As he scrolled through the transaction history of the last 6 months, the analytical part of his brain began to highlight the anomalies in a cold, neon light. There were small, staggered withdrawals at first, amounts of $5,000 and $8,000, categorized as miscellaneous expenses for the Arts Foundation. But as the summer progressed, the trickle had turned into a torrent. He saw a series of large transfers to an entity called Vane Holistic Systems LLC. The total was staggering, $450,000. Arthur felt a sharp, metallic taste in his mouth. That was the money intended for Grace's doctorate and the equity from the sale of his family's original estate in Maine. He dug deeper, accessing the corporate registry for the state of Oregon. He found the filing for Vane Holistic Systems. The office address was a virtual suite in downtown Portland, but it was the signature on the Articles of Incorporation that made his breath hitch. Eleanor Sterling was listed as the sole managing member and chief executive officer. Julian Vane's name appeared nowhere on the document. He was merely listed as a third-party consultant with no legal liability. The architect understood the play immediately. Julian was not just stealing the money, he was building a perimeter. By making Eleanor the face of the corporation and the primary signatory on every bank transfer, Julian was ensuring that when the inevitable fraud investigation began, she would be the one standing in the center of the blast radius. He was grooming her to be his financial human shield. She had signed her name to a mountain of debt and fraudulent medical equipment contracts, believing she was building a legacy, while Julian was simply preparing her for a federal prison cell. Arthur leaned back, his eyes reflected in the cold blue of the monitor. He thought of Eleanor humming in the kitchen, dreaming of a new life with a man who had already drafted her indictment. The depth of the sociopathy was profound. Julian did not just want the wealth, he wanted the total destruction of the mark so that no one would be left to testify against him. Arthur acted with the silent efficiency of a man who had spent a career managing assets under fire. He picked up his secure satellite phone and dialed a private number in New York. It was a boutique wealth management firm that handled the Sterling family trust, an inheritance from his mother that he had kept separate from the joint marital assets. He spoke with a clinical authority, ordering the immediate transfer of all private holdings into a new, offshore entity that Eleanor could not reach. He then initiated a freeze on his individual credit lines and moved the remaining balance of his personal savings into an encrypted digital vault. He was not just protecting his money, he was cutting off the oxygen to the fire. By isolating the remaining capital, he would force Julian to move faster, to become more aggressive, and eventually, to make a mistake. Arthur then began the laborious process of printing every bank statement, every wire transfer confirmation, and every fraudulent contract Eleanor had signed. He organized them into a forensic binder, a paper trail that led directly from their dining room table to Julian Vane's downtown condo. As the printer hummed in the corner of his study, Arthur realized that he was no longer a victim. He was a predator waiting for the right moment to snap the trap shut. He looked at the total on the screen, $450,000. It was a high price to pay for the truth, but in the architect's world, the cost of a war was always secondary to the necessity of a total victory. He would allow Eleanor to continue her dance for a few more days, but the stage she was performing on was now entirely of his design. The financial investigation was complete, the evidence was secured, and Arthur Sterling was now ready to move from analysis to active neutralization. The mists of Portland had settled into a heavy shroud over the West Hills as the week of the Arts Foundation Gala approached. Arthur Sterling done in the kitchen, watching Eleanor through the steam of his morning coffee. She was vibrant, her skin glowing with the borrowed light of a secret passion she believed was her own rebirth. She spoke of the gala as a turning point, a moment where her legacy would be solidified. Arthur, playing the role of the supportive and slightly tired retiree, leaned against the counter and dropped the bait. He mentioned that he had been reconsidering his stance on her new venture with Julian Vane. He told her that the vision behind Vane Holistic Systems was more profound than he had initially realized, and that he was prepared to move a significant portion of his private trust, perhaps $750,000, to ensure its success. He watched the pupils of her eyes dilate, a classic physiological response to the promise of a windfall. Eleanor reached across the granite island and squeezed his hand. She called him a visionary, her voice thick with a rehearsed affection that made the bile rise in his throat. She immediately suggested that they host a private and intimate gathering in the presidential suite of the Benson Hotel following the main event. She promised to bring Julian Vane so they could finalize the details of the partnership. Arthur nodded, his face a mask of grandfatherly pride, while his mind already calculated the line of sight for the cameras he intended to plant. That afternoon, Arthur drove to a nondescript law office in the Pearl District to meet with the one person he could trust with the total destruction of his marriage. His sister, Bryn Sterling, was 76 years old and widely considered the most ruthless divorce attorney in the Pacific Northwest. She sat behind a desk cluttered with evidence of 30 years of domestic warfare. Arthur dapped the forensic binder he had compiled on her desk. He did not ask for sympathy, he asked for precision. He showed her the $450,000 paper trail and the 0% paternity report. Bryn looked at the documents with a clinical detachment that matched his own. She told him that she would have the emergency ex parte motions ready to be filed with the court at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. She explained that with the evidence of financial fraud and the biological deception, she could secure a freeze on every asset Eleanor touched and ensure that Arthur retained full ownership of the West Hills estate. With the legal perimeter established, Arthur turned his attention to the technical requirements of the trap. He visited a high-end electronics shop in Beaverton, run by a man who had once been a communications officer in his old department. Arthur acquired 2 ultra-high-definition pinhole cameras and 3 multi-directional microphones capable of filtering out ambient noise. He spent the evening in his study, testing the encryption on the digital receiver. He was no longer a husband, he was a field officer preparing a safe house for an interrogation. On the day of the gala, while Eleanor was occupied with her hair and makeup appointments, Arthur arrived at the Benson Hotel. He had reserved the suite under the foundation's name, claiming it was for the keynote speakers. Moving with the silent and deliberate efficiency of a man who had not forgotten his trade craft, he began to bug the room. He placed one camera inside the ornate molding of the fireplace mantel, angled perfectly to capture the seating area. The second was hidden within a heavy mahogany bookshelf, camouflaged by a set of antique encyclopedias. He secured the microphones under the silk upholstery of the armchairs. He tested the feed on his smartphone, the image crisp and the audio clear enough to hear the hum of the hotel's ventilation system. The room was now a theater of operations. The night of the gala was a spectacle of silk, diamonds, and forced laughter. The grand ballroom was filled with Portland's elite, all of them eager to be seen supporting the arts while sipping expensive champagne. Eleanor looked stunning in a deep emerald dress, the diamond necklace around her neck acting as a glittering anchor to a past she was desperate to leave behind. Arthur stood at her side, the perfect and doting husband, shaking hands and nodding at the right intervals. He watched Julian Vane move through the crowd with the effortless grace of a shark in shallow water. Julian was in his element, his charm a lethal weapon used to disarm the wealthy and the bored. When the main event concluded, Arthur leaned in and whispered to Eleanor that it was time to move to the suite. He saw her signal to Julian with a subtle nod. As they walked toward the elevators, Arthur felt the strange and cold calm descending upon him. The adrenaline was there, but it was regulated and channeled into a singular focus. He checked the receiver in his pocket. The signal was strong. The architect had designed the structure, the bait had been taken, and the pieces were moving into their final and predetermined positions. Tonight, the performance would end. Tonight, the recording would capture the truth that 25 years of marriage had failed to reveal. He held the elevator door open for his wife and her lover, his smile as sharp and cold as a winter morning in the mountains. The trap was set, and for the first time in 60 days, Arthur Sterling felt entirely in control. The heavy mahogany doors of the presidential suite at the Benson Hotel clicked shut, sealing the three of them into a silence that felt thick with the scent of lilies and old money. Arthur Sterling walked to the ornate wet bar, his movements slow and deliberate, mirroring the persona of the weary retiree he had perfected over the last 7 days. He poured 2 measures of Macallan 18-year-old scotch into heavy crystal tumblers, the amber liquid catching the dim light of the chandeliers. Julian Vane stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantel with the practiced ease of a man who owned every room he entered. He looked at Arthur with a mixture of amusement and poorly concealed contempt, a predator who believed his prey had finally crawled into the corner to negotiate a surrender. Arthur handed a glass to Julian and took a seat in one of the wingback chairs he had bugged only hours earlier. He took a slow sip, letting the peat and smoke settle on his tongue before he spoke. He told Julian that he was a man of logic and that in his 72 years, he had learned that certain forces were simply too powerful to resist. He claimed that he had seen the way Eleanor looked at Julian, and he had realized that the $450,000 already invested was a small price to pay for her happiness. But more than that, Arthur whispered that he was interested in a $750,000 sitting in his private trust. He told Julian that he wanted to buy into the vision of Vane Holistic Systems, not as a husband, but as a silent partner who understood the necessity of a total market capture. Julian's eyes sharpened, the pupils dilating as the prospect of $1 million harvest sat within his reach. He took a long drink of the scotch and sat opposite Arthur, leaning forward with an intense, magnetic energy. He told Arthur that most men of his generation were too blinded by ego and tradition to recognize a revolutionary shift in the human experience. He began to speak with a chilling, clinical detachment, dropping the facade of the spiritual life coach. He admitted that the diagnostic platform Eleanor believed they were building was merely a vehicle for a high-frequency capital rotation. He told Arthur that the beauty of the system was its opacity. Because Eleanor was the sole signatory and the chief executive officer, the legal shield was impenetrable for Julian himself. Arthur leaned back, his face a mask of contemplative greed. He asked Julian if Eleanor was truly a partner or merely a necessary asset for the Portland launch. This was the pivot point, the moment where the sociopath's arrogance would be tested against his caution. Julian laughed, a short and sharp sound that echoed in the quiet suite. He told Arthur that Eleanor Sterling was a bridge, a very expensive and aging bridge that had served its purpose. He admitted that she was a classic mark, a woman so desperate for the spotlight that she never bothered to read the fine print of her own destruction. He mocked her for believing in soul optimization, calling it a psychological lubricant used to ease the transfer of her $450,000 into his offshore accounts. Arthur watched the digital counter on the receiver in his pocket, knowing that the microphones were capturing every word of the confession. He pushed further, asking Julian about the similarities between the Portland venture and the previous successes in Seattle, San Francisco, and Denver. Julian didn't even flinch at the mention of the other cities. He took it as a compliment to his consistency. He told Arthur that the script never failed because the demographic never changed. He described the women in those cities as expired resources who were grateful to pay for the illusion of being special one last time. He bragged about the immunity he had built through the use of limited liability companies and non-disclosure agreements, explaining that Eleanor was currently carrying enough financial liability to ensure she would spend her 60th birthday in a federal penitentiary if she ever dared to cross him. Julian leaned back, a smug smile playing on his lips as he told Arthur that the $750,000 would be moved into a new account in the morning. He told Arthur that he was smart to choose the winning side, and that once the funds were secured, Eleanor would be phased out with a quiet, choreographed scandal that would leave Julian clean and Arthur free of a delusional wife. It was the total admission of a predator who believed he had successfully flipped his primary adversary into an accomplice. Arthur set his glass down on the mahogany table with a quiet, final thought. He looked at Julian, and for the first time in 56 days, he allowed the mask of the tired retiree to drop. The cold, lethal intensity of the senior behavioral analyst returned to his eyes, a gaze that had broken war criminals and double agents. Arthur told Julian that he had a profound misunderstanding of the room they were in. He stood up and walked toward the heavy velvet curtains that separated the sitting area from the dressing room. Arthur pulled the curtain back with a sharp, decisive motion. Eleanor Sterling was standing there, her face a ghastly shade of gray, her eyes wide with a horror so profound she seemed unable to breathe. She had heard every word. She had heard her lover call her an expired resource and an aging bridge. She had heard him detail how he had engineered her path to a prison cell. The diamond necklace around her neck, the symbol of her supposed new life, looked like a noose in the dim light. Julian Vane froze, his crystal glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the hardwood floor. The amber scotch pooled around his expensive Italian shoes, a dark stain on the perfection of his performance. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ragged, sobbing breath that finally escaped Eleanor's throat. Arthur looked from his broken wife to the stunned predator, his voice a calm and clinical whisper. He told Julian that the recording of the last 20 minutes had already been uploaded to a secure server and that his sister, Bryn, was currently waiting at the precinct with a team of federal investigators. The architect had finished the construction. The gala was over, the mask was gone, and the only thing left was the cold, hard reality of the consequences. Arthur walked toward the door, leaving the two of them in the wreckage of their own lives, the recording device in his pocket still pulsing with the rhythm of a total victory. The heavy doors of the presidential suite did not just open, they were breached with the practiced authority of a federal tactical team. Agent Owen Ramsey and 4 investigators from the White-Collar Crime Division stepped into the room, their dark windbreakers a stark contrast to the gold leaf and velvet of the Benson Hotel. Julian Vane attempted to straighten his jacket, his mouth opening to launch a defensive volley about his rights and his medical standing, but the words died in his throat as the first pair of steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Arthur Sterling stood by the window, his silhouette a cold and immobile shadow against the city lights. He did not look at Julian. He did not need to witness the frantic, pale expression of a predator who had finally been snared. The recording Arthur had secured was more than a confession, it was a roadmap to a decade of interstate wire fraud and grand larceny. Ramsey led Julian toward the exit, the surgeon's Italian shoes scuffing the carpet with a desperate, uneven rhythm. As the door closed behind the federal agents, a hollow silence filled the suite, broken only by the shivering breath of Eleanor Sterling. She was collapsed on a silk sofa, her emerald dress bunched around her knees, her hands clutching the diamond necklace as if it could still provide the status she had so recklessly discarded. She looked at Arthur, her eyes searching for a shred of the blind devotion he had provided for 25 years. She began to whisper about being a victim, about how Julian had drugged her mind with promises of a new life. Arthur turned to face her, his expression as barren as a winter landscape. He told her that a victim did not sign away $450,000 of their daughter's future. He told her that he was done listening to the script. The drive back to the West Hills estate was conducted in an absolute, suffocating void. Arthur steered the Cadillac with a mechanical precision, his eyes fixed on the road while Eleanor wept beside him. When they arrived at the Tudor house, the yellow porch light cast long, skeletal shadows across the lawn, reflecting the ruin of the life they had built. Arthur led her into his study, the room where he had spent the last 2 weeks performing a forensic autopsy on their marriage. He did not offer her a chair. He did not offer her a glass of water. He simply sat behind his desk and placed 2 manila folders on the green blotter. The first folder contained the divorce decree and the emergency ex parte orders his sister Bryn had secured that morning. Arthur informed her that as of 9 o'clock the following Monday, her access to every joint account was frozen. He explained that because of the infidelity clause in the Sterling family trust and the documented evidence of her financial fraud, she had forfeited any claim to the house or his private holdings. She would be allowed to retain her individual retirement account and her personal belongings, but the life of the West Hills socialite was officially terminated. Eleanor stared at the papers, her signature on the previous fraudulent contracts now acting as a weight that would drag her into a deep, legal abyss. Then Arthur pushed the second folder toward her. This was the controlled demolition he had prepared in the darkest hours of his investigation. Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the genetic markers until they landed on the bold, black text at the bottom of the page. 0.0%. The color did not just leave her face, it seemed to leave her soul. She looked up at Arthur, her mouth working but no sound emerging. For 25 years, she had carried the secret of Grace's paternity like a hidden gem, believing that Arthur was too analytical and too trusting to ever question the origin of the child he raised. Now, that secret was a bomb that had detonated in her hands. Arthur spoke with a voice that was devoid of any heat or anger. He told her that he had spent 20 years teaching a child to be a sterling, unaware that he was merely a convenient host for another man's legacy. He told her that the betrayal of the hotel rooms was a minor offense compared to the 25-year fraud she had perpetrated against his very identity. He watched her subdue, her head dropping onto the desk as she sobbed for the life she had lost. She realized that she had traded a man who would have died for her for a man who was willing to let her go to prison in his place. Arthur stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow over his wife. He did not scream. He did not demand to know the name of Grace's biological father. To him, that information was now irrelevant data from a closed file. He told her that she would have 48 hours to pack her things and vacate the premises. He mentioned that he had already contacted a modest apartment complex in Redmond and paid the first month's rent from her remaining personal funds. He was not being kind, he was ensuring she had no reason to return to his door. As he walked toward the door of his study, Arthur looked back at the woman he had once thought he knew. He saw only a mark, a woman who had spent a quarter-century building a masterpiece of deception only to find herself buried under its weight. The demolition was complete. The structure of the Sterling family had fallen, and as Arthur stepped out into the hallway, he felt the cold, sharp air of a man who was finally, and devastatingly, free. 3 months had passed since the night at the Benson Hotel. On a quiet afternoon in late February, Arthur Sterling stood with Sam Vance at their father's grave in a secluded corner of a Portland cemetery. The rain had ceased, leaving the air crisp and smelling of damp earth and pine. Arthur placed a small bouquet of white lilies on the headstone, a silent offering to a man he had idolized for 72 years and understood for only 90 days. Sam stood beside him, his hands tucked into the pockets of a heavy wool coat, his presence a steady and undeniable anchor. Arthur looked at the name Thomas Sterling etched in granite and realized that while he had lost the father he thought he knew, he had gained the brother he never realized he needed. The legal machinery had moved with a swift and clinical finality. Guided by the ruthless expertise of his sister Bryn, the divorce was finalized in late November. The West Hills estate, the family business, and the bulk of the Sterling assets remained entirely with Arthur. He had successfully recovered the $450,000 from the frozen accounts of Vane Holistic Systems, ensuring that the financial future he had built was once again secure. Eleanor was now living in a modest one-bedroom apartment in Redmond, working as a junior clerk for a medical billing company. Her career as a high-flying arts administrator was over, her reputation dismantled by the very man she had hoped would elevate her. Arthur felt no joy in her ruin, only a profound and quiet sense of closure. She had made her choices, and now she was living within the architecture of her own consequences. The federal trial of Julian Vane had been the final act of justice. Arthur had attended every session, sitting in the gallery alongside Audrey Kingsley and the other survivors of Julian's predatory cycle. On the 5th day of the proceedings, the recording from the Benson Hotel was played for the jury. Julian's own voice, cold and arrogant as he described Eleanor as an aging bridge and an expired resource, had sealed his fate. The jury took less than 4 hours to return a verdict of guilty on all counts of wire fraud and grand larceny. The judge, citing the systematic and heartless nature of his crimes, sentenced Julian Vane to 18 years in federal prison and ordered the permanent revocation of his medical license. As Julian was led away in shackles, Arthur had caught Audrey's eye and offered a single, respectful nod. The predator was no longer a threat to the shadows of the world. However, the most difficult structural challenge remained the truth about Grace. In June, Arthur stood in the audience at the University of Washington, watching his daughter walk across the stage to receive her master's degree in engineering. She looked radiant, her blonde hair catching the sunlight, her eyes bright with the same intelligence that Arthur had always admired. He looked at her and saw 24 years of memories that the DNA report could never erase. He saw the child he had taught to ride a bike, the student he had helped with calculus, and the young woman who still called him whenever she needed a voice of reason. Arthur had decided not to tell her the truth yet. He chose to wait until she was settled in her new career in Portland, until her own foundation was strong enough to withstand the seismic shift of her origin. He realized that fatherhood was not a matter of genetic markers or biological luck. It was an act of consistent and unwavering choice. He had chosen Grace every day for 24 years, and he would continue to choose her for the rest of his life. Biology was the blueprint, but love was the actual construction. As Arthur sat on the back porch of his estate that evening, sharing a quiet beer with Sam, he looked out over the glowing skyline of Portland. He was 72 years old and starting over, but he was not starting from nothing. He had his integrity, a brother who understood his scars, a daughter who loved him, and a sister who had fought for his future. He had learned that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves to maintain the illusion of a perfect life. He had learned that real strength is not found in the absence of betrayal, but in the capacity to rebuild after the walls have fallen. This story of the Sterling family serves as a profound reminder that our identities are not fixed by the mistakes of our past or the deceptions of those we love. We are the architects of our own peace. Betrayal may shatter our world, but it also clears the ground for a more honest and enduring structure. Life requires us to have the courage to face the truth, even when it quakes beneath our feet, and the wisdom to know that family is defined by who stands beside us when the mists finally clear. We hope this journey through the shadows of trust and the light of justice has resonated with you today. If you found value in Arthur's story, please consider subscribing to our channel and clicking the like button. Sharing this video helps us reach others who may be navigating their own difficult chapters. We want to hear from you. How did you feel about Arthur's decision regarding Grace? Have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything you thought you knew about your own family? Please share your thoughts and your stories in the comments below. We truly value the opportunity to listen to the reflections that come from deep within your hearts, as your experiences remind us that we are never truly alone in our struggles. We wish everyone watching this video a life filled with good health, joy, and a deep sense of daily peace. May your foundations be strong and your heart stay true. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in our next video.